So it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce our two writers tonight. I actually think this is an absolutely fantastic pairing of writers. Many of you have already been introduced, have been lucky enough to work with Omar through the University of Winnipeg community, working on different types of writing. Some of you are already familiar with the type of writing that Omar does, but Omar Akkad is an Egyptian-Canadian novelist and a journalist, and is also our 2023 Jake Macdonald Writer-in-Residence. For 10 years, he was a staff reporter with the Globe and Mail, and he covered the war in Afghanistan, the military trials at Guantanamo Bay, and the Arab Spring in Egypt. He was most recently a correspondent for the Western United States, where he covered the Black Lives Matter movement. His debut novel, American War, was published in 2017. I know some of you have read it. Is an international bestseller, and it has been translated into 13 languages. American War won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, and the Kobo Emerging Writers Prize, and has been nominated for more than 10 other awards, including the Rogers Trust Fiction Prize and the Amazon.ca First Novel Award. His second novel, What Strange Paradise, was published in 2021 about a young boy fleeing Syria. It won the Giller Prize for Fiction, the Pacific Northwest Book Award, and was longlisted for the 2023 Dublin Literary Award. It was also chosen as a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and the Globe and Mail, as among others. Amazing. Our second guest, Aisha Abdel Gawad. Aisha has been published in the Kenyan Review in American Short Fiction and the scholarly journal The Muslim World in a special issue on Anglophone Muslim women writers. She won a 2015 Pushcart Prize for her short story, Waking Luna, which I just read today and is spectacular. You should all read it. After graduating college, Aisha worked at the Arab American Association in New York, a community center and social service agency serving the immigrant community in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is also where her first novel is set. She is currently a high school English teacher. Don't tell me how you wrote a book and are also a high school English teacher. Please tell us the Herculean task. I have to ask about this later. And she is based in Connecticut, and Between Two Moons is her first novel. I'm so happy to have the two of you here. I'm fascinated by both of these books, where they come together, and the intersection, especially of characters who are kind of on the precipice of life-altering events. I think you'll both have lots to talk about. So I'm going to pass it over to you, and pass it over probably to Omar here, and then we'll figure it out from there.
Thank you so much for that, Sandy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is a real privilege for me. A while back, we were trying to figure out the exact date, and my brain has turned to mush, so I was not able to figure out the exact date. But a while back, this advanced reader copy showed up at my house of this novel. I had not heard of the novel. I had not heard of the author. I had no idea what the hell I was getting myself into. And then I proceeded to read this book, and it was a really jarring experience, in the sense that I felt like I knew everyone in that book. The cultural precision, the emotional precision, the psychological precision was unlike almost anything I'd read in a very long time. And for me, especially, to feel like I know these people I don't get that feeling very often, because I was born in Egypt, but I had to leave when I was 5. My dad had to get the hell out of the country, and I've moved around a lot. And so the sense of feeling like an experience on the page hits close to home is very rare for me. But that was exactly what Aisha's novel did. And that is why I asked that she be the other writer that I get to talk to today. And I'm just so thrilled to be able to do that. In fact, I thought that what was going to happen was just me peppering her with questions for the entire hour. I was told very recently that, in fact, that's not exactly the format, and that we should do short readings. So if you want to get up and get some popcorn, or if you need to use the bathroom, now is the time, because I'm going to do I'm going to do a very short reading that you absolutely do not need to listen to. Just the first couple of pages of my second book, this book called What Strange Paradise. What do you need to know? You don't need to know anything. This is chapter one. I shouldn't need to tell you anything, right? Because when you pick it up, you're going to start reading from chapter one. So anyway, this is a book that I think of as a repurposed Peter Pan. The fable repurposed as the story of a contemporary child refugee. I think that's all you need to know. The child lies on the shore. All around him, the beach is littered with the wreckage of the boat and the wreckage of its passengers. Shards of decking, knapsacks cleaved and gutted, bodies frozen in unnatural contortion. Dispossessed of nightfall's temporary burial, the dead ferment indecency. There's too much of spring in the day, too much light. Face down with his arms outstretched, the child appears from a distance as though playing at flight. And so too in the bodies that surround him, though distended with seawater and hardening, there flicker the remnants of some silent levitation, a severance from the laws of being. The sea is tranquil now, the storm is past. The island, despite the debris, is calm. A pair of plump orange-necked birds, stragglers from a northbound flock, take rest on the lamppost from which hangs one end of a police cordon. In the breaks between the wailing of the sirens and the murmur of the onlookers, they can be heard singing. The species is not unique to the island, nor the island to the species, but the birds, when they stop here, change the pitch of their songs. The call is an octave higher, a sharp, throat-scraping thing. In time, a crowd gathers near the site of the shipwreck, tourists and locals alike. People watch. The eldest of them, an arthritic fisherman driven in recent years by plummeting cherubfish stocks to kitchen work at a nearby resort, says that it's never been like this before on the island. Other locals nod because even though the history of this place is that of violent endings, of galleys flipped over the axes of their oars and fishing skiffs tangled in their own netting, and once during the war, an empty Higgins lander sheared to ribbons by shrapnel, the old man is still, in his own way, right. These are foreign dead. I will leave it at that, and I will very, very happily turn it over to Aisha Gawad to hopefully do a reading of her own.
Thank you. And it's so lovely to revisit. I must have read What Strange Paradise, I don't know, at least 3 times, but still that opening description, I feel like it really hits, especially now, right? The idea of that, like the child, right? And the body and the terror of not knowing what has happened. So thank you. Okay, I'm also going to read just a very short passage. Let me think about what you need to know. So the book is it's set in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and it's this Egyptian-American family. And very early on in the book, you find out that the older brother, Sammy, is about to return home from prison. And in this very short passage, I'm going to read one of the sisters, her name is Amira, she's our narrator, is sort of remembering a time before he went to prison in their childhood. And I think that's all you need to know. In the end, when it was clear they would never be able to afford this place, Mama and Baba would get the same advice from this man as they would get from all the others. Police officers, judges, neighbors, teachers. Watch him. Watch this kid like hell. Sometimes the advice was also to beat, to deprive, or to smother with love. But it was always to watch. People seemed to believe that if you were always watching, you could stall the disaster that loomed ahead of you. It was similar to the way we would all be watched in the years after the towers fell. Watch them. Never let them out of your sight. Look at them through binoculars, in grainy security footage, through the eyes of informants and undercovers, through the sights of rifles, through drones and satellites, in mosques, in restaurants, on subways, in deserts, on mountaintops, in university dining halls, at soccer matches, beauty parlors, delis, in caves, in palaces, community centers, in cells. If you see something, say something. Watch them, watch him. You can avert disaster forever this way, until that one day, that 1 second, when you look away. And now, years later, we wondered why Mama and Baba were wandering the apartment like two amnesiacs, their eyes lolling around, searching for Sammy, trying to go back to the time when one or both of them had accidentally closed their eyes. Thanks.
I'm so happy you read that passage. I mean, to me, so much of that novel is about watching. It's about watching and being watched, and who has the privilege of defining the narratives around those two sort of prisms, how you're viewed and how you get to view others. And I guess I wanted to start just by asking you about the genesis of this story, when you start writing this book, and how early on in the process, I mean, if I am interpreting the book correctly, how early in the process you are thinking about the idea of watching as a sort of central load-bearing narrative beam.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I first started writing the book, it was sort of these like vignettes, these stories. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was about these two girls. They were friends before they were sisters and eventually twins. They were Arabs and they were Muslims and they lived in Brooklyn. And they were kind of doing a lot of mundane things in the stories that I was writing. They were just hanging out at the basketball court. They were, running errands for, some Arab auntie or something. And in a lot of these stories, I noticed that there was this element of watching. The girls were often watched, oftentimes by men, or sometimes by just like other Arabs in their community. But it wasn't until I started working at this community center that Sandy mentioned in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which ended up being sort of one of the places that the NYPD, the New York Police Department, its kind of surveillance programs of Muslims after 9/11 was kind of very intense in this particular neighborhood. And when I started working there, that's when I sort of added in this other element of watching. So there's the sort of ordinary sensation of being a young woman, and especially a young woman of color, who are watched, right? And then you add on top of that this second layer of watching, which is the sort of state surveillance of Arabs and Muslims. So I sort of quickly became interested in what is it like for these teenage girls to come of age with those two sort of dual and intersecting forms of watching.
This is an incredibly broad question. You can sort of write a PhD thesis with the answer, but like, can you give me an impression of what it was like to live in that post 9/11? I mean, NYPD was following people into like shawarma places, and it sort of, there were the minute details. I forget it. I think it was an AP report that like put out the actual details of the kind of stuff that they were noting, and it was the most benign. I mean, what was that like, that sort of environment for somebody who wasn't there?
Yeah, it's almost, you can read these reports, these NYPD reports, and you're right, the Associated Press sort of broke the story that the NYPD was spying on Muslims and Arabs. And you can read a bunch of these NYPD reports, and it'll be something like, an undercover or an informant walks into an Arab shisha cafe and counts the number of chairs. And this is the point, right, where I always make a joke. I'm like, ooh, Muslim chairs, like, watch out, But these very mundane details were like instilled with menace, Or one of my favorite details is oftentimes it was recorded what was playing on the television in an Arab business. So if it was Al Jazeera, that was suspicious because that was kind of coded as like you're a terrorist sympathizer. If it was not Al Jazeera, that was suspicious, because then it was like, well, why aren't you playing Al Jazeera? What do you have to hide? So, what are people supposed to do? And you want to laugh, like it's so ridiculous. But it was also very real. And I like to say that it is still real. Um, that particular surveillance program was sort of found out and shut down, but how much more sophisticated have surveillance technology gotten in the last 10 years? And that's something that I wonder about, right? Is in what ways is this still happening, and to which communities, right? Because of course this doesn't just target Muslims or Arabs, but it was you asked what does it feel like? It was like I mean, it made you feel crazy, right? It made you feel paranoid. I was really young at the time. I had just recently graduated from college, and my friends and I were always making jokes like, are you an informant? Are you the one? Like, or, we would clarify our own jokes. We'd say, just kidding, in case someone was listening. Um, and so when the Associated Press broke that story, I felt almost a sense of relief, like, oh, I'm not crazy. Like this was happening. Um, and I think there's a lot of young Muslims, right, who grew up under that sort of that feeling.
I mean, I remember um, I'd been asked by my newspaper to go down to Gitmo and cover the military trials for some of the prisoners down there. And to do that, you have to get a security like background check thing, and you have to go through DOD. And so I'm on the phone with the PR flack for the Pentagon, and I'm nervous as hell, and I do the stupid thing I do when I'm nervous, which is try to make a joke. And so I'm on the phone with this guy, and I'm just like, oh, I bet I'm the first guy named Omar who's going to Gitmo willingly. And just like tumbleweeds, just crickets, like exact.
It's a
Yes,
funny
I
joke.
actually have a lot of reporters from the Arab world, and it's just like it was a weird thing because you sort of, and I think this is one of the things about your novel that really resonated with me. And again, maybe I'm misreading it entirely, but just this notion of like subconsciously how many masks you have in your back pocket just to navigate life on this side of the planet. Whether it's like my accent and knowing that my accent and how well I speak English disarms things, or knowing cultural references, or not being too Arab at any given moment to sort of get by. And I think one of the things that sort of fascinates me about the characters in your book is that they're everywhere on that spectrum of which masks they're willing to wear at any given moment, and whether those masks actually might supersede your actual face at a certain point, that it becomes more of your life, just to kind of get by in this place that is supposed to be your home, right? I mean, I left Egypt when I was 5. I could go back there, and I'm sure I could navigate it, but I'm wondering how you think about that in the context of the kind of work you were doing. I think you were working with immigrants for a while, right, in Brooklyn, and how that sort of plays into your thinking about what somebody has to do to sort of fit in and get by, to sort of not stick out in this community.
Yeah, I can relate to what you were saying about the English you speak disarming people, or like, I think I felt all the privileges I had, right? That some of the clients that we worked with didn't have, like all the ways that I might be able to move through spaces undetected. Um, and one of the things I was really trying to mess with when I was writing this book was the notion of the good Muslim or the bad Muslim. And I think that for a lot of Muslims, not just in the US, I imagine in all over the West, right? There's this pressure to prove ourselves as good. And good often means not too Muslim, right? Or the good Arab, like not too Arab, right? And what that means is, of course, um, you don't really practice. If you're a Muslim, you don't really practice. It's kind of like cultural Islam, right? You don't really pray 5 times a day. You're not too Muslim. Um, you're not too attached to whatever your Arab heritage is or your culture or your practices. You assimilate, you kind of smooth out or erase those other parts of you to prove that you're not a threat, right? Or you're not an enemy. Um, and I was interested in seeing how different characters in the book might react to that pressure. And I think some of them are really antagonistic to that, right? And want to sort of reclaim the notion of what makes one a good Muslim or a good Arab.
You know, this is something that I think about a lot, and I talk to a lot of Arab writers on this side of the planet about this notion of, for lack of a better phrase, the kind of spectrum of hand-holding with respect to the reader when you're writing this kind of story. Because I know writers who are on very much one end of the spectrum, where every Arabic word is italicized and immediately explained afterwards. Like, we're not going to lose you here. We're gonna make sure. Versus the other end of the spectrum, which is, hey, if you're not familiar with this, you're not familiar with it. And I'm wondering how you think about that, just on a craft level, where you are on that spectrum, or how much you move around that spectrum when you're writing this kind of story.
Yeah, I was really like, I sort of ended up, I think, more towards the side. Like, I don't italicize the Arabic in the book and I don't translate it. And I try to do almost no explaining of some of their like of Muslim ritual. There's maybe a teeny bit, but or even just like of Arab cultural practice. I just try to let it be and let it exist and trust that my reader can figure it out. And I think I was sort of indebted to, this is not like, I'm not on the vanguard of this, right? But I'm especially indebted to like Latinx and Chicano writers who I think really sort of pioneered a shift away from translating Spanish or explaining, right, their characters' lives. And it was important for me not to assume that my reader is not Arab. Like, maybe my reader is Arab, right? Like, and maybe you were saying, and I feel so flattered that you felt seen on the page, right? But I'd like to think that some Arabs could pick up this book and feel like, oh, it's a book for me. When does that happen? When does that happen, that we open books and see ourselves there, not being explained, right, to a non-Arab audience, right? Not being explained away on the page. And then, of course, for my reader who is not Arab, I wanted to trust them. Like, you can handle this. You can join this world. You can connect to these people on a human level, and I don't need to explain. Like, you can meet me where they are. Um, that's kind of how I approach it. I don't know. What do you think?
No, it's interesting you bring that up. This sort of like writers from other lineages, because for me that's very much a similarity there. Like, I remember picking up a book, this novel called We That Are Young by Preti Tanasia, who's an Indian British writer. And it's basically sort of King Lear, like repurposed King Lear. It's succession in modern day India. There's a big sort of conglomerate in India, and the patriarch of the family is on his way out, and everybody's maneuvering to kind of take over. But it was one of those books that I sort of put down. It's a doorstop of a book. I have it around here somewhere. And there was no, like, you don't understand Hindi profanity, like, good luck to you. There was no attempt at all. And there was something so refreshing about there being no hand holding, and the act of doing it was liberating for me in a way that has influenced my writing ever since. But I find that one of the other things that sort of kicks in when you said this, like, how often is this going to come along, right? Like how often is Penguin Random House publishing this kind of book? How often are the big publishers? That to me scares me a little bit, because it puts me in a place where I get this thing that I sometimes call Atlas syndrome, where I feel like I have to carry the entirety of every facet of what it means to be Muslim or Arab. So like my character is going to be, she's going to wear the hijab and the niqab and also none of these things, and she's going to be really devout and not devout, and all my character is going to be all things that it is possible. And you end up with sort of mush on the page. You end up with no human being at all, because there is nobody who is all of these things, you know. And I find that I have a difficulty with that, where knowing that maybe this is the only book that Knopf's going to publish this year that has people who look like me in it scares me into what is, to be perfectly honest, bad writing, because I let that weigh on my mind a little bit too much. I don't know if you've ever sort of felt a similar thing, but that's one of those things that I have real trouble and have to actively work to kind of shake away.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. There's like the burden and the honor of representation, right? It can be thrilling. Like there's no more thrilling praise that I've heard, right, than an Arab or a Muslim reader telling me that they felt seen in my book. I'm like, oh my God, right? Like that's all I ever wanted. And yet the burden to do that, right? Like the pressure to do that can feel overwhelming. And because there's so few of us out there writing, I'm like, I can't represent all Arabs. I can't represent all Muslims. Like I'm just writing about this one family and this one community in Brooklyn. I can't claim, right, to see or to speak to everyone's experiences. And then I think, yeah, like how to want to be able to cover everyone, right? To do everyone justice. I find like the only solution for me was to sometimes write the bad material and then like know it was bad and then be like, I have to really mess this up. You know what I mean? Like I have to like really take whatever like crappy stereotype I'm working with here, and really kind of pull it apart. And so sometimes I feel like getting the bad writing out is it almost helps.
Yeah, I do that part, and then I don't do anything else. I just get the bad writing out, and then that's the end of the process. Then my editor has to deal with it. I got to ask the question that sort of Sandy kind of touched on earlier, which is how the hell you even write this book while you're working as a full-time high school. What is your writing practice like? And also, what is teaching high school like? What does that bring to the arsenal when you sit down to write? I'm just curious about that facet of your life and how those two work together.
I'm not going to lie, they don't often go hand in hand. They're kind of adversarial most of the time, but you know, I love teaching high school, first of all. So, and that's actually part of why it's sometimes not good for my writing, is because I love what I do. Um, and I care deeply about doing it well. I care deeply about my students. So really for me, the only way to write is to write very early in the morning. I also am a mother of two young children, so I have to wake up before I've started thinking about schoolwork, before my school day has begun, before I've seen any of my students, before I've seen my own children. And that's really the time, the only time that I have to write with a clear head. If I try to write any other time of day, even at night, for example, my head is just filled with like generally my students and my kids. Um, but you know, but on the other hand, I do feel like, I mean, I don't know if I'll write another book that's like primarily about teenage girls, but this book was, right, primarily from the perspective of teenage girls. And I spent all day, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week with teenage girls. And that was helpful. It kept me, I mean, I think all of us can remember adolescence in sort of a visceral way. Like you can just like feel it, like the memory of it in your body, and you're like, oh God. But I'm seeing it every day. Just the emotions, right, of teenage girls in particular, and how they sort of wear them on the sleeves and their sleeves, and with how they test themselves out for the world, different versions of themselves out for the world. So there's access to that, right? Which was, I'm sure, really useful for me as I was writing the book.
Have any of the students read it and sort of come to talk to you about, like, has it gone full circle?
A few, and I'm pretty like, I try to keep the worlds fairly separate. So I don't know if I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of like my teacher self and my writer self. I've had a few students ask, like, oh, can you teach it to us? I'm like, no, that's a nightmare for me. I would never want to do that. If you want to read it, um, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions. But I think it's a little thrilling for them, but I also think it's a little strange, right, to see a very different side of me. The book is even like politically, right? I'm not bringing like all my political positions right into the classroom with me, and it's a much more political work. So like it can be a little odd sometimes, for me to kind of bridge those two worlds. Um, and I'm wondering, like, I know you're asking me questions, but can I ask you a question? Can I, like,
Please.
okay, so I'm thinking like I was thinking about me as a teacher and how does this work with writing, and then you also as a journalist, and I'm curious. I dipped my toe very briefly into journalism. I'm a terrible journalist. So, but I'm thinking like, how does that, for me, like the style of writing, even the way of thinking, I feel like is so different. I'm wondering if your background as a journalist, if you like how that impacts your fiction, and even the ways that you think of fiction itself as a category. I don't know. That's kind of a broad question for you.
Yeah, I mean, so my degree's in computer science. I can't program my way out of a paper bag, but Arab parents, like there was no way I was going to become a painter, or a writer. You become an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor, right? And computer science was my like grand bargain of like maybe I'll be able to do something creative and still meet that obligation. Of course, I couldn't. I was hopeless at it, and I knew that from the very first class. And so I spent all my time at the student newspaper in college. That's where I got my education. Um, and I ended up getting very, very lucky and landing a summer internship at the Globe and Mail. And I remember my first day there, this guy, Greg O'Neill, who was the dean of the back desk editors. This guy had been around for like 40 years by the time I showed up. And he sat me down and he said, listen, kid, I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell every reporter who comes into this building. At the Globe and Mail, the journalists are gods and all the editors are atheists. And it was his way of explaining to me what was about to happen to my copy, right? Like one adjective too many, you spend any time trying to describe what the sky looks like we're going to slash that to all hell. And so you look at my writing now and how purple and just like overwrought it is. That's after 10 years of having that instinct beaten out of me by the back desk editors of the Globe and Mail. So you can imagine what I was like at the beginning of this process, right? So they sort of they took a lot of that out of me, which was really helpful. Also, it was just an education in the world, in being in the world. There's a lot of places that I went to and a lot of things I saw that otherwise I would have never gotten to experience. And almost all my fiction is just the residual emotional baggage from that. Because for me, journalism is by definition about answers. If you don't have answers to who, what, where, when, how, you don't have a piece of journalism. Fiction is where I go to sit with questions. And and questions that I know by the end I will still have no answer for. So having those antagonistic muscles, I think, made my life a lot easier. Sometimes I end up in the nowhere space in between, which is always a really difficult and dangerous place to write. I'm thinking of writers like, I'm not nearly in this category, but I'm thinking of writers like Svetlana Alexievich, for example, who does these oral histories, but is very careful not to call herself a journalist, because she's taking what people have told her and she's moving it around and she's creating an entirely different narrative with it. That to me is a really fascinating space. And it's a space that I only feel somewhat able to explore because I had those 10 years in journalism. So I know where the boundaries are, and I know the thing that I'm trying to tear apart. The flip side of that, of course, is that you understand how systems of power work in a way that otherwise I don't think I ever would. I understand, for example, who we can conduct really piercing, dangerous journalism about and not worry nearly as much because they don't have the lawyers, right? There's a profile from a million years ago of Conrad Black, who, if you don't know who Conrad Black is a billionaire, Canadian former billionaire, doesn't matter. This profile came out of him that you can't even find anymore on the Globe's own archives, own digital archives, because his lawyers swooped in. You have to go and find like the microfiche to find out that this thing ever existed, which is something I had never seen them do in my 10 years for anybody else. You find out what money does, you find out what power does. And that's instructive, just as someone who writes generally. I don't think I would have gotten that education otherwise. I think it's my version of, I suspect, I'm being presumptuous here, what you learn about human nature from being around those teenage kids, for hours a day. Things that maybe otherwise you might not have gotten that access, I suppose.
And, you were asking me about this kind of this burden of feeling like, okay, how many more of us are they going to publish this year? Or, I'm going to be the only one. Or do you ever feel like, from your background as a journalist, thinking about like the stories that are not being told, do you ever feel a burden to tell those stories in your fiction? Like, I'm thinking, one of the things I felt when I first read What Strange Paradise was like, oh my God, why is there not more literature?
Why hasn't somebody done this better?
No, that's not. I mean, I love this book. I think it's an excellent
that's
book.
what
But
I was thinking about it for sure.
But like, we're living through and witnessing, maybe the most extreme refugee crisis like in the history of humanity, and there's almost no literature about it. And yeah, I'm wondering, maybe you don't feel that pressure, but I feel like that's be something that I would struggle with, right? If I was out there, right, doing this work, or I think you said understanding how power is working, kind of seeing things from another angle, do you ever feel like, is it good pressure, negative pressure, or do you not feel that pressure to kind of tell those stories in your fiction?
I mean, I think a lot about this story that I feel like every Arab American writer has heard at some point or another, which is the one about Edward Said in the early 80s going around to the publishing houses in New York, the big houses, trying to get the work of Naguib Mahfouz translated into English. Because if you're going to translate one Arabic writer, like that's where you start, right? And getting rejected over and over again, and finally asking one of the heads of these publishing houses, like, why? This is really, really good writing. Why? And the publisher responding, yeah, it's good and everything, but Arabic is a really controversial language. And I think about that sentence because it seems to encapsulate so much. It says so much, maybe inadvertently, about the systems we live in. I mean, I used to think of when I thought, and I thought constantly about that question that you're bringing up, this notion of like, why isn't there more of this, right? This is one of the defining catastrophes of our generation and of this century. And I used to think it was the function of a broken system. And the older I get and the more I spend time thinking about it, the more I think that the opposite is true. I think it's a function of a system that is working exactly as intended. You know, you brought up that sentence that I think every Arab in the West sort of has tattooed on a certain part of their subconscious, which is that famous, like, if you see something, say something, and the benign maliciousness of that. But that's not all you have to live with, right? You have to live with the flip side of that coin, because sometimes you see something and it's glaring and you are told to say nothing. And that's your role. That's the role you have to inhabit, at risk of losing your career, at risk of all kinds of punishment. That's not a mistake to me anymore. I don't think of that as a broken system anymore. I think of that as a system working exactly as intended. And so in that context, the writing I'm doing is the thing that is broken. It's the sand in the gears, right? That's how I've come to think about it now, because for me to continually wake up every day and think that just a small adjustment is what's going to fix things is not tenable. Like, ideologically, psychologically, emotionally, it's not tenable for me to think that way. Certainly not right now. And since the only thing I know how to do is write, the writing is going to be the sand that I throw in the gears. The downside is that I feel impotent all of the time because the sand is not doing anything, and it's very clear that it's not doing anything. But in terms of orientation, that's sort of how I think about it. I don't know. I mean, how do you think about it?
Yeah, and I don't know. I think I've come along on a very similar journey, even from when I started as a writer to even when I started this book to when I finished, 10 years. I think politically, ideologically, like, I changed a lot in that time, and thinking about, what this book could do or not do, and really thinking about how, right, the ways that Muslims and Arabs were sort of recodified right after 9/11. The function was to, like, sort of neutralize us, right, to keep us silent, because anything that came out of our mouths was so, you said Arabic is a controversial language, right? Like, anything that comes out of our mouths is political, is threatening, is menacing, is dangerous, right? And why is that, right? Well, maybe it's because we were supposed to shut up about imperialist war on terror that was going to kill millions of people, and maybe we were supposed to shut up about that. And so I think you're right. I think it is about these systems working exactly as they should. And I like that metaphor of the sand in the gears. I think that was one of the things I was interested in too, was what if there are these Arab teenagers going through New York City, and there are the signs everywhere and all over the subway, if you see something, say something. And what if they don't, right? Or what if they say what they're not supposed to say? Or, thinking about what rules, when you exist under that kind of pressure, right? What rules can you afford to break? And how many rules is one rule too many? Yeah, and that's kind of like the tension that I think that the young people in my book are kind of constantly experimenting with.
with a whopping 6 minutes to go before the hour. Sandy, do you want to come in with the crowd
I'm
question?
sneaking in. Can I ask my question? Yeah, I have a question. So I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, you guys have touched on it a little bit because like Omar, I didn't know about the computer science. I was listening to that interview with Mark Medley and I knew about the journalism, but I didn't know about the computer science. And I think, you both have such super interesting backgrounds really as writers. Like I'm curious, like I want to hear like what kinds of, we have a lot of emerging writers who are like super interested in like research and like writing as research. And then I know, Omar, you were saying in that interview that you had a couple of books that never even like saw the light of day before American War. So I'm curious for both of you, how do you figure out the balance of research and like how do you put limits on your research? I think for both of you, you're both writers who did a lot of research, some of it more immersive research. But yeah, I'm just curious if you could both talk a little bit about your process of research. And this is a weird question because I have my friend Salah who just got his British passport today. He just became like a British citizen. I asked him about it. He's a writer and he was smuggled into Calais in the back of a truck with a polar bear in it. And I asked him about doing research. And he said, I made it all the way from Egypt to France in the back of a car with a polar bear. That's all the research I ever need to do. And which I love. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like, what is your approach to research? Like, and I think in that interview with Mark, Omar, you said that there was like limits you had to put on your research. I wondered if that was part of the journalism kicking in. So yeah, maybe you could both maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. I think for me, my central relationship with research is initially, I think at its core, prompted by cowardice, which is to say that fiction for me is and has been since I first started writing as a child, my first avenue of retreat from the world. I'm not good at anything. I don't have a particularly robust social arsenal. I am awkward as hell most of the time, but I can write, and it's my only way of making sense of the world. And so I retreat into fiction, and so I retreat into research. And in fact, there are many times where I know the payoff is going to be not worth the effort. In my first novel, this book called American War, which is very speculative, sort of futuristic, I spent weeks reading all the research I could get my hands on about the potential of spider venom as a painkiller for what ended up being not even a full sentence, like a passing mention in a sentence. It was the effort to payoff ratio was nonsense. It was a complete waste of time, but I could retreat into it and I could get away from the world, which is essentially the only reason I write. The only reason I'm in fiction is to retreat from the world. So for me, it's not just a matter of like, I've become better at knowing the payoff ahead of time, but it still doesn't change my relationship with research. I still do the spider venom thing where I will just read an entire book about what forest fires do to redwoods, knowing full well that it's the opening paragraph of a chapter of my new manuscript, and that's it. Because it's comforting to be able to retreat that way. So that's generally how I think about it.
Great. Yeah. What about you, Aisha?
It's interesting because, for this book, for Between Two Moons, I had a different relation. I like resented it. Research. Not all the time. I was riveted by reading the NYPD reports in a really sort of creeped out way. But otherwise, I found it like, oh, I have to do research. Like for me, it was I just wanted to like immerse myself in the minutia of like what these characters are cooking for dinner and what are the sounds of their neighbors' televisions playing as they go down their hallways. Like nothing that required research. And And I became sort of resentful of the need to do some research. But now I'm working on this new project, which is so much more research oriented. And now I can understand, Omar, what you're saying. I can see myself really go like spending, reading 6 books on one thing. And I'm like, do I need this? And I can't stop myself. So I'm experiencing this for the first time now.
It's like the pleasure turning to pain.
Mhm.
And the other thing I guess I wanted to ask before, there's only one or two questions in the Q&A, but I'm just wondering about the relationship to place. Both of you have books that are really, in a lot of ways, about place. Like Omar, I was thinking a little bit about Obasan and like time and place and trauma in your book. I was wondering if that was some of the work that you were actually weaving in consciously, or did that actually come from just writing the book itself? And I actually did a little search because I was interested in the amount of times that you use the word time in a very vague way, like later, in time, sometime. It was like 150 mentions, which I thought was super interesting. And like, I just think about that idea about trauma, like disconnecting time, place, and but I think both of you have written books that are very place-based. So I'm wondering if you could speak just really quickly about your relationship to place in terms of craft and how you brought that out in your work. And I know for you, Aisha, too, I mean, you actually worked in Brooklyn for quite a long time. So I'm wondering how that came out on the page. Did anybody come back to you and say, oh, this really represented my experience of living in Brooklyn? Like, how did that work for you?
Yeah, it's been thrilling when people, especially from Bay Ridge, or like I'm not a New Yorker, right? I grew up in Virginia. So like when New Yorkers can co-sign the book, that's like, and New Yorkers do not like to give people credit, right? So that's thrilling when I can do that. Um, but for me, rooting the book in not just in Brooklyn, but in this very particular place, Bay Ridge feels different from a lot of other places in Brooklyn, was really helpful for me because I felt like if I hadn't done that, I would have gotten lost in the weeds. Like if you think about it, and the way I think about this book is really it's a reflection on what is it like to grow up in America as a Muslim or an Arab during the war on terror. That's huge, right? Like you're going to write about the war on terror, like that's enormous. And so I think I could have gotten lost in that enormity, and to root it in this really hyper specific place, I think helped me stay focused and not get lost in big ideas.
That's the same thing. I mean, of the migrant crisis, for example. Like, I mean, it's the same type of like huge issue, right? And Omar, yeah. What about you two? Yeah, I'm curious about how that works for you.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I got at one point during the copy editing process for American War, I don't know where Penguin Random House found this guy, but they sent the manuscript to this guy who specializes in time. That's all he does. And I got an edit back that was color coded. Every reference of time at the minute level was green, and every at the year level it was some, and mismatches were red, and there was so much red in the manuscript because I'd screwed so much of it up. But they had a copy editor who just focused on time, and I found that fascinating. I can't imagine what that job is like, to just be immersed in fiction purely through the lens of time. I think for me, a couple of things kick in. One is that because I left the country of my blood at age 5, and that I've been a guest on someone else's land ever since, I have a couple of natural impulses that I'm never going to rid myself of. The first is just an utter disrespect for the concept of the nation state as a somehow sacred, untouchable entity. One of the first things I do in almost all my fiction is I move borders around. And if you pick up American War, the eastern seaboard of the United States is gone. It's underwater. The Southwest is now Mexican territory again. In What Strange Paradise, I'm working on the eastern edge of Crete, but it's never said, it's never stated. And all the flora and the fauna is invented. So that's one impulse. The other is that my relationship with home is completely absent geography. It's home for me is a function of memory and relationship. And both those things I think of as inherent violations of time. I think of memory as inherently violating time. And in terms of relationships, there's entire decades of my life that took place over the course of a weekend, hanging around with my best friend one summer in Qatar when we graduated high school that year, and we drive around town. That's years of my life. In reality, that was like a week, in the summer. And so I think I'm naturally drawn to a place where I can play around with time that way. And obviously in What Strange Paradise, it's a structural element as well. We're moving before, after, before, after. Now we're back in the middle of it. That I do it structurally, but I also do it at the sentence level. And sometimes it results in some pretty crap writing, to be perfectly honest. I mean, you described it as interesting. How many times I used vague notions of time, and interesting is one way to describe it. Like ham-fisted is another, right? It doesn't always result in good writing, but it is an impulse I feel whenever I go to the page, is to move into a relationship with time that isn't functional in any real world way.
Yeah, I was thinking of it more like the kind of like the traumatized body, like kind of getting messed up, like not being able to put things in a like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, like just that inability to do that. But a lot of students that read the book talked to me about the structure too, about the before and the after as being really really meaningful for them in terms of the way that the story moved forward. Is that something that was always there when you were writing it, or did you add that?
No, that showed up about halfway through. The book went through 8 drafts, and it was around draft number 4 that I realized that it wasn't working. It used to be, it started where it started, and then it stayed on the island with a ton of flashback sequences, and it was just killing the pacing. And then I realized that I had this very Old Testament, New Testament back and forth. I had this narrative that was concerned with an exodus from Egypt, and I had this narrative that was concerned with a miraculous rebirth. And what if I tried to codify that in some way? And that's where before and after showed up. And it was, once that wall broke down, everything else kind of fell into place for sure.
Yeah. And what about the sort of like Peter Pan references and the like, and that kind of like all the kind of literary references, did they just come about as you were writing? Like,
I know that was all there from the very beginning. I wanted to take a comforting fairy tale that Westerners have been telling their kids for the last 100 years, and I wanted to invert it. And one of the interesting things is that in researching the history of it, I found that it had already been inverted. The origins of Peter Pan are much darker than the Disney version that we have today. J.M. Barrie's brother died young. He died in a skating accident a day short of his 14th birthday. And his mother, it crushed her. She never recovered. But one of the things she would say to try and comfort herself is, at least he'll never grow old. And so the Peter Pan thing is not Peter Pan syndrome, the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. It's the child who never gets a chance to become a man. So it had already sort of been inverted, and I was taking it back to that place. But no, that was all there from the beginning. And in fact, I had to strip a lot of it away because I was adhering so closely to the original that it was starting to seem really, really contrived. And so a lot of the later drafts were actually trying to strip as much of that down as I could.
Okay, so we're at 9:07, but there is one question, and I think this is a good. I said I was gonna give you easy questions, Maris. This is very Maris Kreisman. At the end of every podcast, asks you to recommend some books that you like. So Mustafa Marwan says, other than your books, of course, what other Egyptian writers in English books do you recommend? And I would add to that, just to close, I'd love to hear from both of you. What are some books that you're reading that you love right now that you would love to suggest that other people read as a next step? Yeah, Aisha, do you want to go first? Sorry, I put you on the spot now.
No, sure. Egyptian writers. Okay. Daf Suwaif, who writes primarily in English already, so you don't have to read her in translation. She's brilliant. She was really meaningful to me when I was younger. And let me think. I just read something over the summer by Noor Naga called If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. Really, really interesting. book. Trying to think of new. I mean, there's the classics, of course. If you haven't read Nekib Mahfouz, I don't know what you're doing with your life. Um, Omar, what do you recommend?
I mean, certainly Noor's book is a masterpiece. I thought it was brilliant. There's an Egyptian American poet named Marwa Hilal.
Love her.
She's invasive species. I absolutely adore it. It contains one of my all-time lines, which is something like, they will say show, don't tell, but that assumes most people can see, which is a line I bring up in almost every craft talk that I give, because I think it says something really important. I think she was doing she had a new one on the way. I don't know if it's out yet or not, but last I checked. Anyway, Invasive Species, a very beautiful book of poetry. Basma Abdelaziz is only available in translation, but I think she's one of the bravest writers working in the world today. She put out a novel called The Queue, which almost landed her in jail. And then the follow-up was called Here is a Body. I think that's the English translation. It's basically about the Rabaa massacre, which is this massacre of protesters that happened post Arab Spring. She sort of fictionalizes it just enough maybe to get past the censors, but everybody knows what she's talking about. And like the cops are going around Egypt pulling those books off the shelves. Like, and I'm not sure she can even continue to live in Egypt as a result of her writing. Just incredibly courageous stuff. Her day job is working as a psychiatrist for torture victims, many of whom were tortured by the state. So she's just operating in a different space entirely. So if you get a chance, definitely pick up those books. In terms of just overall what I'm reading right now, maybe the best thing I've read in however many years now, I don't know, is a book that got a ton of attention recently, an author who got a ton of attention recently, and the book's called Minor Detail. And the author is Adania Shibli, a Palestinian author who was set to be given a prize by the Frankfurt Book Festival, and they pulled out at the last minute and claimed that it was a joint decision. It was not. They were just cowards. That novel, which is a very short novel, it's written in 2 parts, is one of the best things I've read in decades. And I don't want to tell you too much about it. It's just as good a sort of thematic cause and effect novel as I think I've ever read, and deserves to be read by everyone. So yeah, sorry, I could continue, but I'll stop there.
That's great. I mean, you've given some other names during the pre-Titanesia as well. And I was thinking of Banu Kapil. It would be interesting too, not Egyptian, but yeah, there's lots of great writers. Those are great suggestions. I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much to both of you. This conversation was fascinating. Again, went in all sorts of amazing directions. And I hope that everybody goes out and buys Aisha's book. I'm sure you already have Omar's. But thank you to everybody for coming today. It was a spectacular conversation. So thank you very much to both of you. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Nice to see you.